Good morning, everyone. We had a very full day yesterday, and I'm going to just take us through a bit of a summary while everybody's getting their coffee and getting ready and logging in. And basically, you'll probably have noticed that the format of this event has changed from previous years. We used to try and squeeze in as many speakers as possible, and we had a lot of sponsors, and they all wanted their 10 minutes of fame in the audience. But with it being a virtual event, we decided that we would cut down on the number of speakers and try and give the speakers a longer period to present their discussion. And in that way, rather than 15 minutes where you can't really get any message over, we've tried to give each of the speakers between half an hour and an hour, and then have lots of time for questions. And I think it's worked pretty well so far. We were a bit worried that we wouldn't get any questions, because when we do it live, people are very reluctant to throw questions at the speakers, and we often find it's difficult to get questions. So we had loads of questions lined up for the speakers, but the ones we got from the attendees were so overwhelming that we never ran out of questions at all. So to all of you that have been attending and throwing questions at the speakers, thank you for that. We'll try and get to all your questions. If we miss any of them, accept our apologies. It's not intentional. We're not deliberately cutting anyone out. It's just a balancing act within the time limit. Okay, we started off yesterday. We had Jay Bachwan from the Water Research Commission. Jay gave us an overview, a status quo of what is going on in South Africa. In a nutshell, it wasn't good news. The 2010 assessment of non-revenue water in South Africa was about 37%. The 2016 assessment came in at about 41%. And according to Jay, there hasn't really been any official figure released since 2016. But it does appear that the non-revenue water is increasing in the country as a whole, which is a worrying trend. And Jay was indicating that the Water Research Commission is doing all it can to try and assist water utilities and municipalities in addressing their non-revenue water through the dissemination of information, reports, software, all freely available. So there's a massive amount of information, meter management, pressure management, leak detection techniques, case studies, software available free of charge from the Water Research Commission. So any municipality that wants to know what's going on, that's a good place to start. It's not where you won't end up, but it's a good place to get some information to start with. We then had Stuart Hamilton, who's the chairman of the IWA Water Loss Specialist Group. Stuart gave a comprehensive overview of the leak detection and such like, the different equipment that you can use. He pointed out that most of the equipment is based on the same it's based on the same approach, and one set of equipment is probably pretty much similar to another set, as long as you're buying high quality equipment and not some very low quality stuff that's copycatting on the big guys. So there's a number of companies that do that type of equipment. We mentioned a few of them. We're not promoting anyone in particular. There's lots of good gear out there. I think what Stuart mentioned, which I think was important, is it's often the support that you get locally that is as important, if not more important, than the equipment you're using. And that applies to a number of things, valves, etc. as well. If you've got good local support, a municipality would be well advised to use that, because they are the people that will help you when you need help. Neil Meyer, a colleague of mine at WRP, then gave an overview on pressure management, which was really good. He talked about the different types of control that you can use, from fixed outlet to time control, to flow control, to closed loop control, to intelligent closed loop control, to really, really smart intelligent closed loop control. Or non-loop control. There's all sorts of different buzzwords and things that you can do. Sometimes using the basics is all that's needed. And if it's appropriate, then go for the more sophisticated stuff. Just bear in mind, the more sophisticated you go, the more pieces of equipment or more links in the chain to go wrong. So as it's a bit like an engine, a car engine, the more bits and pieces you add to it, the more things can go wrong. So it's always a balance, and appropriate selection of equipment is important. Go for good equipment and go for what is appropriate. We then had Unati Noludwe and Ivy Masela from the city of Cape Town. They gave two very impressive presentations, and they were, Unati basically was explaining what they were doing on leak detection in Cape Town as an example for a big metro, to show what some metros are doing. That was very good. She basically was putting into practice what Stuart was telling everyone to do. So Unati was actually doing the dirty work there and actually getting it done. So that was really interesting. Ivy was giving a comprehensive overview on what Cape Town has been doing on pressure management. She gave so much information. We had tons of questions. I think one of the key things that I took out, two key things I took out of her talk, was the fact that they were willing to drop the pressure right down to about 5 meters throughout in all areas of Cape Town where they had the capability to do it, in order to cut down on the water demand and water losses. That meant that they were taking the water pressure down well below the minimum level of service that is normally acceptable, which in Cape Town's case is 24 meters. And that has all sorts of implications. And I think today we'll be discussing that, particularly with regard to Peter Flower's talk, which will be next, and then Bambos Charlambos's talk, which will be after coffee break. What this idea of bringing the pressure down to 5 meters, rather than going on to intermittent supply, to me, that is a key issue that is very, very important, and one that every municipality should watch, because that is what you may have to do if you end up in a day zero situation. So that was an important one. The other one that was very important that Ivy talked about was the percentage, your percentage losses in Cape Town. Cape Town was, back in 2016, Jay showed that you were the lowest non-revenue water in the country at 21% for the big metros, that is. And Ivy showed that that figure has increased up to about 34%, I think she mentioned. We touched on that, and I'll show you a couple of slides in just a second. We'll go on to that. So, yeah, so that was the overview of yesterday. And what we're going to do today, I've been doing some slides for you. I've been working really hard this morning. Touching on Ivy's presentation, which really I found quite interesting. If you have a city, let's say you've got a city, don't worry about the units. Think of megalitres a day if you want. Then it's quite close to actually Cape Town. You've got revenue water of 800. And you've got non-revenue water of 200. Okay, so it's a nice, I've tried to be nice and simple. Quite interesting, it's quite close to what Cape Town actually does, but that's just pure coincidence. Don't put anything into that. Total input is 1,000, okay? Your non-revenue water as a percentage is 20%, okay? So it's quite simple. 200 over 1,000 is 20%. Okay, you now have the monster of all droughts coming in, and it's a 200-year drought, just coincidentally, similar to what Cape Town had. That drought causes you to do certain things which reduce the consumption. So during this drought, let's put that one away. We managed to get the consumption, the revenue water, we reduced that from 800 to 500 because all our teams are working flat out to reduce the consumption. Okay, your losses remain basically the same in this particular case, okay? It's a very rough calculation, but we're assuming pressure management hasn't played a big part in this. So we're keeping the losses, the burst pipes and the meter errors. Let's just assume that number stays the same. Your total is now 700. Because your non-revenue water has not gone down, because you've driven the demand down, and when you're in a crisis, that's the only real thing you can do very quickly is drive the demand down. It's very difficult to implement pressure management during an emergency situation because you need to have the pressure reducing valves in the ground. And it takes you 6 months to a year to put in a pressure reducing installation. Your non-revenue water jumps up to almost 30%. So because you've been successful, because you've actually driven the demand down, your non-revenue water has increased. It's almost doubled. So that is why percentages can be misleading in cases where the consumption changes significantly. And that is why the IWA often recommend that you don't use percentages and that you use some other indicator. Unfortunately, everybody still uses percentages and they'll be used for the next 100 years. Everyone understands percentages. It is critical that you understand when they can be misleading. And those two slides show you exactly what that means. Okay, I've noticed while we've been during the interval, I've noticed that SciC has been promoting engineering as a career for people, and you know, they've got all their adverts about career, you know, people with screwdrivers and hammers and stuff like that. So I thought I'd just show you a little video clip here. I don't know if any of you know Dilbert. Dilbert is this is one of my this is a Dilbert clip. So if you can keep quiet and turn your volume up so that you can hear this. It's not a long video clip. I'm going to play the video clip now.
I'm worried about little Dilbert. He's not like other kids.
What do you mean?
Yesterday, I left him alone for a minute and he disassembled the TV, our clock, and the stereo.
That's perfectly normal. Kids take things apart.
Oh! The part that worries me is he used the components to build a ham radio set.
Oh dear.
Is that bad?
Normally I'd want to run an EEG on him, but the machine isn't working. It's worse than I feared.
What is it?
I'm afraid your son has the knack.
The knack?
The knack. It's a rare condition characterized by an extreme intuition about all things mechanical and electrical, and utter social ineptitude.
Can he lead a normal life?
No. He'll be an engineer.
No!
There.
Okay, that's just to support the SciC engineering initiative to recruit people for engineers there. Okay, On to more serious matters. We're going to have two speakers now before lunchtime. The second one is a very good friend of mine and colleague, Bambos Charlambos. I'll introduce him after coffee. He's going to talk on the dangers of intermittent water supply. And we've deliberately put the next two speakers together because, as far as I'm concerned, the two issues are very closely related. So the first issue that we're going to talk about is I'm going to introduce a good friend and colleague, Peter Flower, his talk is going to be about avoiding day zero, and he's going to talk on the Cape Town experience, where Peter Flower and Gisela Kaiser, Dr. Kaiser, were basically in the hot seat, so to speak, as far as dealing with the worst drought in 200 years and having to face the press and the politicians and the critics and the, Peter will tell you all the different people that he had. I'll just tell you a bit about Peter. It's another 40-page CV, so I've condensed it into a couple of sentences here. Peter is a registered professional engineer with nearly 40 years experience in the water sector. He's a fellow of various organizations, including SciC, WISA, and the IWA. He graduated with a BSc in civil engineering in 1978 from the University of Cape Town and obtained a GDE in 1983, also from the University of Cape Town. Peter started his career working for the city of Cape Town as an assistant resident engineer at the Blackheath Water Treatment Plant. And he worked most of his working life has been in the municipal environment for and with the city of Cape Town. He had a couple of periods where he delved into different things, but he's been working almost 40 years for the city of Cape Town. He was in 2019, or before that, he was Director of Water and Sanitation until he retired from the city of Cape Town in 2019. He was responsible for the whole water and sanitation side. I think Peter can correct me. I think the budget was something like 6 or 8 billion rand. It was a big number with lots of zeros on the end. He's got a whole list of projects that he's worked on. I'm not going to even mention, I'll just mention one or two of them. He was a project manager and design engineer responsible for the 500 million rand, and that was in 1991, so it's probably about 2 billion rand now. The Rivier Sonderend / Palmeet River Augmentation Scheme. That won him and Cape Town the SciC Award for the most outstanding engineering project in 1994. I've personally known Peter since about 2000 or 1999, when as a small newbie wannabe engineering company, we proposed a big pressure management installation in Cape Town. We promised huge savings that we never knew we could achieve, but we sort of thought that we might be able to achieve them. And Cape Town had just embarked on a program to start reducing water losses. It was one of the first cities in the country to recognize that demand management was going to be a big issue. And they listened to us, and they gave us the opportunity to build the Kailicha pressure management installation, which was our first big project. And we're eternally grateful to the city of Cape Town for giving us the opportunity to do something that no one had ever done before, and for having the confidence in us to give us a budget to do it, the rest is history. So anyway, I think on that, I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to pass over to Peter. And you've got about an hour, 10 minutes, Peter. That can include questions. So take your time, give us a good, don't rush yourself, and we'll see how we get on there. So I'm going to stop. Peter, you can start sharing your screen now.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, and thank you for your very kind words. And good morning to all of the delegates and fellow panelists, or presenters, I should say. Yeah, just one thing to correct you on what you were saying. I wasn't the design engineer for the Fora scheme or the Refeersonderend scheme. I took over once the construction phase started, but I was part of the design team. But the design team was led by Dave Ramsey at that time. Nonetheless, today I going to share with you what we did in Cape Town during what was a pretty severe drought. But before we do that, I just wanted to say also, some time back, around the time when I think I first met Ronnie, and I was about to do a presentation on a sort of international scale, funny enough, similarly to the way we do it today. Somebody said to me, you know, if you really want to be relaxed during it, have yourself a little glass of something, a nice scotch or wine next to you, and it will make it a lot more comfortable and enjoyable. So I thought about that this morning, but you know, it's only just after 9, so even for me, that's a bit early, so I left that. Right, so welcome, and a virtual welcome to those of you who are not in Cape Town and don't know Cape Town. Please do try and visit us when you do get the chance. Of course, my phone would ring now. Kill that. But what I'll do today is take you through the water supply system for Cape Town, just to give context to what I'll be talking about. And then I'll give you the nature of the drought and how the city responded to it and what we learned from it, what worked and what didn't work. If there's time, or probably not, I'll touch on the Cape Town, the new Cape Town water strategy, and give you some insights into that, where we effectively prepared the strategy just as I was leaving, in fact, the city for Cape Town to become more resilient against future drought. Right, so just to give context, for those who don't know Cape Town, it had a population at the time of the drought of some 4.2 million. A pretty sizable city, metro. And let me get the laser on. The extent of the boundary of the city is, as I'm drawing it now, some 2,500 square kilometers. So pretty sizable. And of course, it's a very unequal city, if you like, as is the country. It has a per capita GDP at that time of some $6,000. And that's about 10% of other countries like Australia, Sweden, and many others that showed an interest in trying to assist South Africa and assist Cape Town in during the period of the drought. But it makes a big difference if you only have 10% of the spending power to react. So it was tricky to have people making suggestions and then having to not say, oh, yeah, thank you very much. So that added an interesting aspect to it. Then access to services in Cape Town are pretty good, as you can see from the indication over here. But a large number of the households are informal and indigent. And where this specifically has an impact on how water and sanitation services are delivered is that 40% of households do not pay for their services. They essentially are subsidized, and that adds a layer of complication. That just gives you an indication of topography, showing you where the dam positions are up in the mountains here and on top of Table Mountain. The view you saw from out at sea was taken from hovering out near Robben Island, looking back, and this is Table Mountain over here for those who don't know. Right, so ironically, the reason Cape Town was established in the first place was water. The seagoing merchants on their way to the east needed to secure supply point. And the city's formal record of water history dates back to some 1834. And I've listed a few of the iconic sort of features going forward through from that time. And the first formal structures were built from about 1850, and some of those, in fact, are still in use, where Cape Town has been storing surface water for use. And the graph shows the total accumulated storage in the blue shaded area, with the water treated per day over the annualized on the dark blue line through the years. So the first dams that were situated on top of Table Mountain really were very small by comparison with the scale of things today. Then Cape Town expanded further out to the Stembras, to the mountains above Gordons Bay, and then built Wemezuk. And it was during the time of the construction of Wemezuk that the National Water Act changed and made it the responsibility of the National Department, in fact, to license large dams, and they took it upon themselves to establish a construction unit and effectively constructed the dams thereafter, which were then the Full Vlei, the Theewaardeskloof, which really doubled the capacity of the system at that time, and then the last one being the Berg River Dam, which was filled for the first time in 2007. So looking at the way the system works, it's important to note that Cape Town uses an integrated surface water system for its supply, and it's known as the Western Cape Water Supply System. And this comprises 6 dams, and as I've mentioned, the last 3 that were constructed, the National Department owns and operates the Full Vlei, Theewaardeskloof, and the Berg River Dam. And they comprise the bulk of the capacity. The city owns and operates the 3 smaller ones, which are Stembras Lower and Upper and Wemezuk, and they allow account for about 15% of the capacity of the system. So the system is integrated through means of tunnels, canals, and pipeline links, and the yield is maximized by operating the system in order to minimize spillage during the winter rainfall season. And the city manages this by changing the loading on the different dams through its water treatment plants, because it can feed into its own ring main, effectively, of bulk distribution pipeline. So it's clearly important for there to be a close collaboration between the city and the National Department in terms of operating and running the system. So now the majority of the water, as you see, comes from runoff. And in terms of usage, Cape Town, as we saw earlier, uses 64% of the yield, and the other urban areas 7%, with agriculture accounting for 29%. One mustn't forget the other factor, which is evaporation, and that on average is about 18% that leaves the dams through the year. So let's have a look at some of the history in terms of rainfall. The system rainfall records date back to 1928, so we have a good data record. And you can see how the variation has taken place over the years, quite significant variation, with an average rainfall just at the start of the drought. And this is in terms of runoff, I must just add. The average runoff was 711 million cubic meters per annum. So the variations above and below that are massive, if one looks at it carefully. So when we approached the drought in the winter of 2015, which in fact is listed here as hydrological year beginning November 2014, we only got 51% of the long-term average. And that's one of the lowest, as you can see, over the record. So pretty significant. The following year was better, but still low at about 64% of the long-term average. But then the big mother came after that, where we got less than 40% of the long-term average. Now, this is on top of the dams already being depressed because of the low rainfall in the previous years. So this is what really hurt. And this 3 years of extreme drought had a calculated probability return period of some 590 years in terms of a calculation the UCT did in the climate section. So the following year, fortunately, the rainfall was about 90% of long-term average. And by that stage, we had already pushed down the demand quite considerably. So the dams were able to recover because of the low demand and the increased rainfall. They were able to recover to about 80%. And that really took us over and out of the really critical period. But it's interesting to note that the very next year, we were down again with a fairly low level of about 70% of long-term average. So we were concerned that that might just have been a spike high again, and we were on a new low. But it would appear that things are normalizing again, and certainly the dams are full right now, in fact, over 100%. To look at the fundamental mechanism of the drought, there was a persistent high-pressure cell that became resident out over the west coast of the southern African continent. And this would persist for the period of this drought. And what it did was, with the normal movement of cold fronts across the tip of Africa, they would normally sweep across and cross over the mountainous areas which held our catchments and drop the rain. But with this high pressure cell, it was forcing these cold fronts to miss the continent. And when we did get any coming, it would just be the tail ends, very low amounts of rain would fall. The majority would then just fall uselessly into the ocean. So the scene was pretty much set, and we felt like we were operating pretty much in the perfect storm. The water levels in the dams were dropping rapidly. The media, there was a heightening awareness and concern. Social media was growing exponentially with negativity and fake news. The politics was a bit of a mess, to say the least. The political environment was very tricky, both at a inter-tier level with the 3 tiers of government, because of different parties being in the central government was the leadership of the country. The provincial party was the DA, and so was Cape Town. But even within Cape Town, there were factions developing, and there was unhappiness there. So that really didn't make things easy for us as officials to manage within the political framework. Revenue, of course, we needed to keep the business going, but revenue was dropping because the sales were down as a result of restrictions. And although we had 3 levels of tariffs that we could impose at different restriction levels, once we went beyond those, we didn't have any more. So we couldn't balance. So that became a challenge as well. And of course, trust was getting down to an all-time low between the city and the public, and the city and the national department, etc., etc. So we had to find our way through the storm. So our approach and strategy was to look at it from 3 different perspectives: managing the dam levels, managing the demand, and then augmenting supply. And those were really I won't say the priority order, but certainly the focus was on the first 2 to start with in the short term. So let me have a look at managing the dams. We've seen how the system yield is utilized, and I'll just go into a bit more detail with agriculture using 29%. And as I've said before, that's controlled by the National Department and how they allocate that. Other municipalities in the region, which get water directly and through the city, take about 7%. And the city uses 64%. And as you can see from the split, residential usage is the highest at 70%, and commerce and industry accounting for another 17%, with the balance going to government and other departmental uses. So the focus was obviously on the residential use to drive the demand down, and that's where we put a lot of our attention. Looking at the 3 graphs along the bottom, I think just to explain, this was unrestricted outflows sort of prior to the drought. This was then, during the drought, what was planned to be used in terms of having the different restriction levels. And in the peak of the drought, this is what actually happened. I'll go through them here. The green is the evaporation portion, which, as I'd said, was about 18%. But as you can see, in the hot, dry summer, evaporation is high, and it tapers off during the wet, rainy winter periods. Typically, you get a similar pattern with the urban demand, which is higher during summer and then drops. You can see this band is a bit narrower here during the winter time. Agriculture, on the other hand, in the purple band, takes the bulk of their water during the summer peak period for irrigation purposes. And this was getting up to a total usage of, it goes up to the, yeah. So let's just have a look here. During the period when the restrictions were imposed, we modeled this and we assumed a conservative level for evaporation. We applied the restriction of 45% for urban. So urban was able to use 55% of their normal allocation, whereas agriculture, because of their lower level of assurance of supply, had a much higher restriction level of 60%. So they had 40% access to their normal allocation, and they would be taking that during the summer season. So this would be what we would expect to happen in terms of demand. What really happened in the end was this pattern here. Fortunately, evaporation turned out to be lower during the peak part of the drought than was expected. And urban pretty much stuck to its prescribed restriction levels and followed that route, whereas agriculture steeply took their water at the beginning of the season, but fortunately was capped down to their restricted allocation level. So I've spoken about the way in which the national department and the city operations needed collaboration. The yield, I've spoken about how that's been maximized. But what I think I want to get to now is just to talk about how we thought we should best manage this from a public perception point of view. And we realized that we needed to try and get as much information out there as possible. But I must just say at this point that up until a certain point in the process, the mayor had decided that no information could go out of the city about the drought management other than through her or one of her mayoral committee members. This meant that myself, Dr. Kaiser, any of my managers were not entitled to talk to any form of the media and give them any information. Now, this made it very difficult because the public, you can fool some of the people some of the time, as the old adage goes. But if you keep on trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, and just remember that there's retired water engineers, working engineers out there that understand the system and understand how things work and couldn't understand why certain things were being done. And we were being driven in a certain direction through the political leadership, which didn't make sense to us. And we were finding it hard to deal with the public response. Anyway, to get back to how we then addressed it eventually, but was to put out a daily dashboard and to track performance. So in terms of the urban usage, this was the 5-year average of the previous 5 years of consumption. This was then the restricted level that we needed to adhere to with the target total for the year in terms of our restricted allocation. And then we would plot daily, at this weekly, the performance against this. As you can see, we were tracking pretty well through the period. But we felt we needed to do that for something we didn't have control over, but were certainly having a big influence on the drawdown of the dams, and that was the agricultural sector. So as you can see here, this was their 5-year usage average over the last 5 years. And their restricted allocation was plotted a year with the targets capping. What concerned us was at the beginning of that period, they were actually drawing far higher than their unrestricted 5-year average of the past. But fortunately, when it came to reaching their cap, the department did in fact curtail their supply. So that was indeed a relief. Then the next important thing that we did in terms of managing the dams was to monitor and track and effectively show the public how this was doing. So, and this was the time when the Day 0 concept came to life. Um, and I need to now explain day zero because it was a concept that was born, I think, in the disaster management environment, but it really caught on in the media. And we realized that we weren't going to be able to kill that. So we needed to take it and use it, but just to define it in our own terms. So we used the modeled system curves and superimposed the actual drawdown each week onto that. And let me just give you some idea of what this actually means. Is you can see there's a line here that says 13.5%. This is the dam capacity of the capacity of the system, and this is time along the bottom. This is the modeled performance of the dams based on sort of average through the year, and this is then the plotted decline of the dam in that particular cycle. This is the 10% level. Now, beyond drawing, abstracting water below that is very tricky. We realized that we could probably still get water out of the system down to about 8, possibly 7%, with some effort, but typically down to 10% with ease. So in terms of the day zero definition, we said that day zero was, although in the public eye at that point, day zero was deemed to be the day Cape Town ran dry. We're saying, no, it's the day that we will resort to extreme restriction measures if we have to. If we reach that day and the dams are not lifting, we would then shut down the resticulation into the residential areas, and we would set up collection points for residents to collect water from. And these were scattered around, and we'd worked out exactly where these could go and how they could be supplied. We would maintain normal supply to key points, obviously hospitals and other key installations, and to commercial areas that needed to keep going in terms of not damaging the economy any more than we needed to. So how much water would we need then to take us through to when we believed that we would be in the midst of the winter rainfall season? So we gave ourselves a 3-month period from that point of day zero. So we worked out that we would need to keep an additional 3.5% in the dams above the 10%. So that 13.5% line was the critical point. So in projecting the performance curve down here of how we were going, we would look back up the previous week, what was the angle of the curve, and extrapolate that down. And where it intersected this 13.5% line was effectively the point in time when we considered that to be day zero. Day zero, when we would go to extreme restriction level. So it was a lot more conservative than people would imagine. But this, of course, is quite a tricky concept for the layperson to understand. So generally, it was just said, day zero, Cape Town goes without water. Now, on that day, on the 22nd of January 2018, a press conference was held, and Maida Lowell decided at that point she would put this out in the public. And so it was put there that we would reach day zero on the 12th of April. And that was the date that is indicated here. And of course, that went around the world faster than, I don't know what. Before you knew it, Cape Town was going to be the first major city to run out of water. So that had quite significant impacts, and it didn't exactly help our stress level. But needless to say, sorry, I'm just having a problem with my mouse here. Needless to say, what's going on? Things changed, and a week or so later, this is what the graph looked like. And what had happened to cause that inflection point there where the curve lifted, the three things. And it's important because it really made a huge difference. So the three things that occurred then were that the National Department actually did curtail the agricultural supply once they reached their cap. It was at that point in time that happened. A significant transfer of water took place from an adjacent catchment, effectively the Groenland Water User Association, which was over the watershed, And we were able to do a transfer down the Palmit River and up into our Steenbos upper dam. That effectively then reduced the decline in the dam levels. And then the third thing was a breakthrough in terms of the response from the public, from the consumers in the residential areas and in industry, to really take on a citizenry approach and work together to try and drive down demand. And we broke through a 600, 650 barrier that we'd had and started to get down closer to the 500 megaliter a day. So with the combination of those three things, that curve flattened out. And in the subsequent weeks, as you can see, this curve flattened considerably. And in effect, day zero became a non-issue because it was being projected out to infinity. So for that year, day zero was not a problem. We, of course, realized that it could occur in the following year. That wasn't that we were out of the woods entirely. And this curve, this graph just really was a plot that we continued showing and still do today in terms of performance against average rainfall, average conditions, to show where we are. And we set these bands here at different levels so that each of them would have a set of operating rules that would immediately be implemented to deal with the condition, so that we wouldn't be caught out not having to sit and still plan what needed to be done. So the second aspect that we looked at in terms of managing this was to look at the demand. And this is very important, and I think the focus should always be on demand as a short-term reaction in any drought. We needed to look at communication, restrictions and tariffs, water flow restriction, and pressure management. So these were our key areas of focus. This graph shows the exponential growth over the last century leading up to the end of it, when we realized that running at 4.5% per annum was not sustainable increase, that is, year on year on the water demand. So that we needed to do something, and as Ronnie mentioned, we were one of the first to really start moving on it. And I can remember sitting in bulk water, and we established a small water demand management unit in the bulk water sector back in 1999, 2000, 1999, and got moving with some small interventions just to get the ball rolling. And then in the following year, the city was restructured as part of the municipal restructuring era, and the water and sanitation department as it is now was born. And into that department, it was decided to have an additional branch, the water demand management branch. And that's where the focus was put for this, the strategy that was developed, and then managing the implementation of that strategy through the ensuing years. And as you can see, by doing that, we were able to turn around this steep curve that was growing exponentially and flatten it. We did have the help of a drought at the beginning of the century, and that gave us the means to implement fairly stringent rules, and many of which stayed as our water savings regulations, if you like. But effectively, Cape Town didn't draw beyond what it did in 2000 until 2015. In 2015 was just at the start of the drought cycle that we went through. We had an exceedingly dry and long summer in 2014-15, and the winter of 2015 then was very poor. And that was when we started to recognize that we could very well be into a cycle of poor rainfall. So that is really critical when you can see that after having had this period with flattened demand, all the reconciliation strategy projections then kept on getting shifted with time. And the projected times for bringing in new water projects got pushed forward each year because it didn't seem necessary then to introduce large billion-rand jobs, projects, when there wasn't really an urgent need for them. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later and its impact. So just at that time, before the drought started, we had managed to get our non-revenue water down to close to 20%, and the losses just under 15%. And this shows the seasonality of the demand in the city, with being a hot, dry summer and a cold, wet winter, typical Mediterranean type of environment. We saw this pattern, and as we progressed through the drought, the peaks, as you can see, started to reduce until we pretty much flattened. But if you look at this, 1,200 megaliters a day at the peak during this last year before the drought started, down to ultimately about 550 megaliters a day. That's a considerable drop-off in demand. And this one just really shows the pattern as we progressed through the drought, and then how it's recovered gradually since the drought. But you can see that we are still well below where we were up there at this point in time, somewhere around an average of about 700, 720 megaliters a day. So we anticipated it would take about 3 years to recover back to normal, but it's actually appearing to take longer. So communication was really key, and we realized that we had to communicate effectively to everybody in the metro, because we certainly couldn't deal with this drought on our own. And we needed everybody to play their part. What were the challenges to communication? Well, I mean, it was a large population and very diverse, and particularly diverse in terms of their media access. So we needed to be very clever on how we did the communication, because we needed everybody to be part of it. And the political environment at the time was very volatile and not particularly supportive of the city. And there were a lot of angry people out there. It was difficult to communicate a very complex water system over which we didn't have full control either, given that it was, there was national department involvement in running the system as well. And this made effective messaging very difficult. So our comms unit then had to address it through as many possible platforms. Obviously, there was the print press, radio, we had some TV coverage. Media engagement, we had, I don't know how many media sessions going where we tried to give as much information through the media as we were allowed to at that time. And then later it became a lot easier once the leadership changed. Social media, we had a group of ladies that would be monitoring on a daily basis all the social media platforms, and then picking up on fake news that was starting to develop, and complaints and things coming in, and try to address these as rapidly as possible and deal with them to be as effective as we could. Business and citizen engagement, we had many interactions with business. I can remember sitting with small groups, big groups, from Chamber of Commerce to 600 people in the CTICC, with one of them, I think I remember, was the tourist and hospitality people, about 600 odd, with the now Premier Alan Windy, Ian Nielsen, the deputy mayor, and myself, talking to give them the sense of what was happening and how they could play a role in helping us to address this drought. Awareness and education was clearly very important too, and we had teams particularly built up over the years in our demand management outfit that would go into the communities, in the informal areas, in the poorer areas, and even with megaphones, driving around, getting the message out there, helping people to understand what was going on, how they could best manage their water demand down as far as possible. Of course, our website would give as much information as possible, and you can see some examples of the things that we put out here. And we would, at each of the stages of the restriction, as it became more and more stringent, give guidance on how people could get through their day. And we would set daily targets for, per capita, And these would be indicated, and as you can see from these, for each of them. And we stepped all the way down to 50 liters per person at the lowest level of restriction as the target. If we'd gone to the extreme level on the day 0, that would have been down to 25 liters per person per day. And then this city water map was a really interesting feature that was developed by our guys. And what they did was they linked the consumption data from our billing system to the property data. And we had these maps plotted out, and the little dots, the dark green one indicate properties that are using less than 6 kiloliters a month, and the light green less than 10.5 kiloliters per month. So these were the water warriors. The properties without an outer dot, instead of us putting a red one on there, it was just then realized and inferred that those were the water abusers using excess of what the restricted level per household was intended to be. So, of course, within your neighborhood, you could see where the water warriors were and the abusers. And believe me, at that time, peer pressure was significant. So it had a big effect. You didn't want to be one of those bad guys. And if you saw there was a bad guy living next to you, you went and did something about it. So it worked pretty well. As I said, communication was important. So eventually, when we could get out the technical information, we started to publish this communication, and we also, with Dr. Kaiser's help, the publishing of the Water Outlook, which gave a running commentary on a regularly updated basis of the details of the technicalities of what was going on. Then, fortunately, or unfortunately, we had to deal with restrictions in the tariffs. Now, there was fortunately a set of tariffs for each of the restriction levels, and we'd started this back in the previous bad drought at this turn of the century, and realized we needed to set tariff levels, get them approved through council in order to meet the legislation, so that we had approved tariffs to just change to during the financial year. We didn't anticipate the need for 7 levels of restriction. So once we got beyond the 3, we had to go to the minister to appeal to be able to invoke a new set of tariffs through that financial year. And we worked on the basis, and this is something from demand management years, of a punitive tariff at the top end to drive people away from using excess amounts of water. And if we look at the diagram down at the bottom here, we can see how this actually works. Down here, you got the different levels of restriction. The box is indicating the color bands for the different steps within a tariff. And as the restriction levels ramped up, you can see the punitive tariff stepped up quite steeply. And even here at level 4, we were up at 100 Rand a kiloliter. So if you went beyond 35 kiloliters in a household, you paid that work. And then in the subsequent steps of the restriction, all the way up to level 6, where we were at 1,000 Rand a kiloliter. Now that is pretty steep. And what this did was highlight, apart from the obvious deterrent for using a lot of water, it highlighted to many people who hadn't been aware of underground leaks in their properties, who had possibly been able to afford to pay a couple of $1,000 a month for water, thinking that it was normal because they just didn't really look at the details on the account. And when suddenly that couple of $1,000 translated into a couple of $100,000 a month, they sat up and took notice. The obvious thing was to say, oh, council, your meter's not working properly, you're overcharging me. But very soon, and we would have a way of dealing with that, and we made them check their system, and they would find by checking at night if the meter's still turning when nobody's using water, there's a problem. So that then actually solved a lot of the leakage on private property issues very quickly. And of course, we published when people were exceeding. And of course, there were obviously the consumers that still didn't want to respond. And we would send letters out as soon as people were exceeding the restricted limit. They would get a letter as an water abuser, And once they'd received 2 and they hadn't responded, we would go in and install a flow restricting meter. And that would then limit them to 10.5 liters per month, or at a certain stage, once the restrictions got even more stringent, 6 kiloliters per month. Initially, the target for installing these was about 2,000 a week, but we realized that there were a large number of abusers, so we needed to step that up. And we eventually installed in the next ensuing weeks, over a couple of months, about 60,000 of these water management devices. Of course, the notifications or the complaints started to ramp up because people wouldn't pay attention to the details when these things were installed, and they were advised at how these things worked and what they would do, and they didn't realize that there was a daily limit. So in order to ensure that they would get through and only use 10.5 kiloliters in a month, they were rationed to 350 liters per day. So once they hit that, the meter would automatically shut off, the valve would shut, and it wouldn't open again until 4:30 the following morning. So of course we would get a horde of people phoning to say, "Oh, my water's off." Meanwhile, it was because they'd exceeded the limit. So of course this created an additional workload, but of course it was worth it in the long run. And just the threat of getting one of these things put in your house was enough to make people change their habit. But it did take a lot of hard work and a lot of sweat and tears. Now I come to a really important aspect of demand management, and this is the pressure management side. And we heard from Ivy yesterday a lot about the city's pressure management program. And this did start back way before the drought ensued. But it's important to note that Cape Town traditionally has had very high pressure. And this is because we have the benefit of our water sources being high with, in other words, a lot of potential energy in the water. And we've utilized this to drive turbines, to run the electricity for the treatment plants, to use the gravity to be able to drop the water down into our bulk service reservoirs, which are scattered around the city at 110 meters above sea level. And having our base storage at that level gives us the provision to supply pretty high pressure all the way down to, obviously, the coastline. In the past, that seemed a good thing, but in the days of demand management, we know that high pressure equates to high loss rate, a leakage rate. So we were progressively expanding pressure management, but when we realized that this was a real opportunity to drive out additional savings, we approached the companies that we've been dealing with as contractors for installation of systems and asked them to come forward with a proposal to really extract a large amount within a short space of time. And over a period of a couple of months, we then developed this pressure management to really expand the zones that were being controlled. And this then realized us an additional 70 megaliters a day, as Ivy mentioned yesterday, with almost half of our reticulation system then being under a pressure managed system. Of course, at the same time, we accelerated the program with the same contractors on our leak detection to assist our own department and to expand the opportunity to derive maximum. And Ivy took us through, not Ivy, sorry, it was Sunati, I think it was, that took us through the leak detection program in the city. And during this period, we, as I said, accelerated this greatly. And what we found, what the contractors found, was that the leakage rate in the reticulation system itself wasn't particularly high. Obviously, we dealt with the bad ones that were picked up, but they found that a lot of leakage in the city was behind the meters, in other words, downstream of meters. And typically in your formal areas, the poorer areas and the indigent areas, where people were not necessarily paying or not paying the full rate of water, it didn't really matter, and those leaks were just carrying on. So we put teams together and set them off into these houses And essentially it was ball valves and just simple washer replacements, and all of a sudden you sorted out your leakage. And that made a big difference. So pipe replacement was another aspect, and that had been running for a long time. Obviously, we tried to ramp that up a bit more, but that's more of a long-term program in terms of savings. And I've given you an indication here of the non-revenue water and how it's performed. And Ronnie has spoken about that and what happens with the percentage as against and this was the period of the drought here, how it came down. And this is the actual non-revenue volume, whereas because it was driven down, the percentage had gone up. In subsequent years now, I note that the actual volume is rising too, but the percentage is rising a lot faster, which makes sense. Right. Ronnie did acknowledge, the city did receive or acknowledgement from the International Water Association for our efforts in driving the demand down. And as I explained, about 55% reduction during that period without resorting to intermittent supply. And I would say that it was a battle, because I did get pressure from political side to move to rationing, because it was seen by them being done in other places, and they said, well, shouldn't we do that here? And I said, definitely not. And I managed to hold out against that. And pressure management really is the answer. If you can drive the pressure down to keep your system pressurized, keep your system charged, but with the minimum amount of flow going out, that is far better than getting all the way to shutting off, draining, and then refilling. Because we all know that you have the problem of burst because of trapped air, but even more so, the dangers of the quality of the water. You drop the pressure, water ingresses back into the pipeline where there are leaks, and it could be sewer water, it could be anything. So you've got huge problems of contamination. So we chose not to go down that route, and I'm very glad to say that we managed to achieve that. So the final leg in terms of managing this was to look at the augmentation side. Now, the Western Cape water supply system had a reconciliation strategy which had looked at the planning going forward for additional resources. And many of these schemes have been identified and allocated to different parties to start investigating, designing, etc. As far as the surface water goes, the National Department was looking at a transfer from the lower Berg River Dam up into full flow as a further augmentation. And we also then looked at ways in which we could improve the yield out of the existing system. Better system management, ensuring adherence to the rules of the system, better collaboration, but also to deal with the invasive alien vegetation, because this was part of the reconciliation strategy right from the beginning, was to start combating the invasive aliens, which are prolific in the catchment and have got worse and worse over the years, with very little effective work having been done by the National Department at that point and others. So we tried to get things going. Certainly the city had been addressing Wemmusik and Steenbras catchments, and pretty much more than 50–60% of the catchments had already been cleared of invasives by the time we got to the drought. But we stepped that up as well in our areas. As far as groundwater goes, city had been operating an artificial recharge system in Atlantis for a good 30 years, very successfully, and it was recognized that this could be expanded to increase the yield there. So that was one of the areas that we were focusing on. And then we had been doing exploratory drilling in the Table Mountain group of aquifers, which is a deep underlying group of aquifers under the Cape Folded Mountain Belt, highly fractured rock zone that was containing a lot of good quality water. And we've been exploring where were the best points to drill for production valves. And these have been identified already by the time that the drought started. So we focused on certain areas where we could start putting production holes down. But this meant drilling down to anything up to 800-900 meters through some of the hardest rock that you can get in the area. So these were expensive exercises. Nonetheless, we pursued that, and they actually are already now bearing in production. The other was water reuse, and the city had been effectively in the reconciliation strategy program. The city had been assigned the role of looking into these alternative supplies. So a feasibility study had already been done on the reuse side, quite an in-depth one. So we were in a position then to go into the mode of putting together a small pilot 10 megaliter a day plant, which could have been then, if we had got to an extreme situation, brought online to produce water into the system. But also we embarked on the planning for a larger scale, long-term production plant, which is scheduled to come online somewhere in the mid-20s, 2020s, by 2024. And it will be set up to feed as an additional source into for a water treatment plant after going through a multi-phase barrier system. Desalination was the other area that Cape Town was tasked to investigate, and also an in-depth feasibility study was conducted, and that was completed in 2015. And coming out of that, the estimated costs were multiple billions of rand capital, with about R1 billion a year operating expense. Now, this did not excite the city fathers in terms of funding, because there were many competing urgent needs, and given the fact that it didn't appear to be that urgent a need for it, sorry, I think I lost my, just get back to where I was. Right, there didn't seem to be such an urgent need for it that we didn't really get the green light to take it any further. So we kept it in as a long-term strategy to be used at some point in time. So at the time of the drought, there was much political pressure to look at desalination. And if I can just quickly go back, there was a period in 2017 when the mayor, when she was still in political leadership on the water drought issue, asked me the question, what, in the meeting, one of the daily meetings with her, what would be the minimum level of demand that the city could have without having an extreme effect on the people's survival and existence, and let's say the economic performance. So we did a couple of quick back of the cigarette box calcs, and I came up with a number of 500 megaliters a day. So she said, right. She said, okay, Peter, I want you to build us 500 megaliters a day of alternative water source like desalination. And then we won't need to be dependent on the National Water Department's dams, because at that time she'd been having a bit of a spat with the national minister, and she wanted to become independent from the department's dams. I said, Madam Mayor, I cannot do that. It's not physically possible to build 500 megaliters of alternative water supply in the space of time for it to have any effect on us dealing with this drought. She said, oh, she said, okay, well, then I'll get somebody who can. But it was at that time then she had just recently appointed somebody into the role of the city resilience officer. And he was then tasked with the role of managing the drought for that period. And he collected a whole lot of part-time engineers, put them into a big room and tasked them with sucking as much information out of my department as possible, coming up with a master plan, which they did. And in the space of 9 or 10 months, they were going to build 500 megaliters of additional water supply. And we were then compelled to now deal with this, and we had to call for tenders, etc., etc. And desalination was one of the big ones. There were 12 desal projects that were highlighted. Ultimately, fortunately, by the time that the leadership changed, we had only awarded 3 of them. And the others are delayed as much as possible and put them in abeyance. And Dr. Koza and I really worked hard to try not to go too far down that road, because we knew it would be completely unaffordable. And I'll deal with the pricing just now. But just to mention, looking at this year, to show the differences, this is a normal year's yield into the system from rain. This is what we got in 2017, 16, 15. But in comparison, if we took a 500 megaliter a day injection into the system through other means, it was going to have an operating cost of about $200 million a year. That's not even to mention the capital cost. But if it was even only 100 million, we'd be looking at about $40 million a year. So really, from an affordability point for Cape Town, given our financial situation and affordability of our consumers, it just didn't make sense. So this one here, just to show you the comparative range of the costs. A typical surface water treatment costs for water historically was around about 7 rand a kiloliter there. Groundwater extraction, typically from our Atlantis experience, was there. Permanent reuse, we'd worked out would be about that. These are properly designed permanent reuse plants, not emergency. And permanent desal, we reckon we're in the range of these costs. And then groundwater extraction being a bit more from TMG because of the depth. And if we go to temporary, which is what was being envisaged by this resilience plan, the costs would be significantly higher for desal and for reuse. As it turns out, the 2, which I'll show you pictures of now, that were put in Monroe, BC and Strandfontein on our Volkswagen coastline, in the end, they came out at about 49 and 51 rand per kiloliter for the 2-year period that they were operated for. Because they were then given out, those are the 3 tenders. There was one in the V&A waterfront and 2 on the Volkswagen coastline. And they were given out as build, own and operate. For 2 years, the contractor had to supply us with the water quality to our specification. And it was an extremely expensive exercise. Fortunately, those were the only 3 that we did in fact put out. Just briefly a few pictures to show you. This is the layout of the various aquifers. This is the sandy, shallow aquifer of the Cape Flats. This is where Atlantis one is. And these are the Table Mountain Group aquifer points that we identified as being fairly good points to target. And we ended up putting in production holes here now along near the Stembos Dam, so that there's quick access to existing infrastructure, and we're continuing to explore and to drill up into these areas here to extract further water. This is a picture of the sandy aquifer on the Cape Flats and the various areas and parcels that we were drilling in, and we would be putting a cutoff barrier along here where we would actually inject water reuse from the wastewater treatment plants in the area, treated and then injected back to keep the saline intrusion out from once we start extracting from this aquifer. And this is just showing the drilling production holes, etc., near the Stembos Dam up in the mountain. Going down very deep, incidentally, these are 600-800 meters down. And these were the desal plants. One were BC, Strandfontein, and in the V&A waterfront. And that's the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Nielsen, Alderman Nielsen, drinking the first little bit of water from the plant. Boy. Sorry, I'm having a problem with my mouse here for some reason. Can't seem to get it out of. Oh, there we go. Right, so at the start, I asked them to put out a poll, and I don't know if it's possible to have that poll put up, and the results. No, it's flower, not fowler, but I'd asked for this to be put up at the start of my talk, so I'm not sure if anybody has yet answered them, but if we can see the results of the poll, that would be great. All right, if it hasn't been put up early, if you could just possibly give your indication there as to what your view is on that question. And I'll just talk about it in the meantime and then give my view on that. We were highly criticized for the severe restriction level that we were imposing. And, you know, typical comments like no or bad planning were coming out. And what lay people and particularly politicians don't seem to realize is that the implementing of restrictions doesn't equate to the water supply system failing. And this is because restrictions are a very important component of managing a water supply system. Unfortunately, typically, and you see this so often in drought situations, is there's a reluctance to impose restrictions because there's a view that it's showing weakness, it's showing failure. And that is really not the case. If it can only be shown to the public that that is very much part of the management process, because in reality, it's uneconomical to try and design a supply system with 100% security of supply. And it doesn't make a lot of sense for a big chunk of infrastructure to be lying unused for a large portion of its time. So yes, you do allow for a lower level of assurance of supply with a reasonable risk level, which then means that when you do get to those extreme times, that you have to apply fairly stringent restriction level. So just to give some background around that, leading up to the start of the drought, and prior to that, I suppose the recon strategy had recognized and considered various forms of additional resource options, and I've spoken about them. And this included the diversifying away from the rainfall dependent systems. And Cape Town had been tasked, as I've mentioned, to look at these alternatives. So it wasn't something that we hadn't considered. But the important thing here that I wanted to mention was that if you look at the pattern of performance of demand, because of the introduction of our pretty effective demand management and conservation strategy, we had flattened that curve. Now, what that meant was that we were pushing back year on year the need for implementation of the new schemes. And that, we realize now in retrospect, is where possibly we could have changed things. So in a nutshell, if your water use efficiency is high, you need to have a much higher level of assurance of supply in the system to ensure against the need for extreme restriction measures during bad drought. So I don't know if we have any answers to the poll yet. If you can perhaps put them up. Okay, so it's pretty even actually, which is not surprising because I think a lot of people think that, as I said earlier, it's a failure to impose heavy restrictions. My own view is that you need to have the ability to be able to impose restrictions, but I think the level of severity can naturally be managed if one is a little better prepared. And clearly, and this is what is included in the new Cape Town strategy, is to increase the level of assurance of supply. If you are now getting to a point where your water use efficiency is quite high, because clearly what happens is as you get more efficient in your use of water, there's less fat left to use when you need to have restrictions imposed to drive demand down. there's far less discretionary wasteful water use to really be able to eliminate during those times. So it's more important that you have a higher level of assurance of supply as you are starting to get more efficient and you have obviously a lower non-revenue water characteristic. So I just thought I would cover that at the end of the discussion on the drought. Now, what I'd like to do now is show you a little video that we produced once we had got into fairly good response from the public, from the consumers. And this just really was a thank you in a way, but also just promoting further good practice. So I'll play the video now. Sorry, that was also just showing the storage record, how it moved after the drought, and how we've filled, and currently we're at about 102% on the system. All right.
Hey, South Africa. This is a message from Cape Town's bucket-bearing bodybuilders, the late-night leak reporters and repairers, the water-saving succulent specialists, our pressure management magicians, the water-wise schoolyard vigilantes, and the Cape's compulsive consumption calculators. It was tough, but together, we refused to waste water. Now we're the #1 water-saving city in the world. Come and see for yourself. It might just change the way you think about water. The City of Cape Town, making progress possible, together.
All right, well, that really covers how I want to deal with the drought. Apart from a couple of slides at the end where I will cover the lessons learned. I'm not sure that there's a lot of time now left. Ronnie, you can give me an idea, because I don't think I'll go through the strategy in detail.
I think you've got about 5 minutes, Peter.
Okay, perfect.
If you can wrap up in 5 minutes, we can postpone the questions to the session in the afternoon, the panel discussion. So we might not, if people, what we can do perhaps is if people want to have coffee and tea between 10:30 and 11, they can do that. And I can keep the floor open to give you a chance to answer some questions, and then we'll kick straight into Bambos at 11 o'clock. So with it being a virtual event, people that want coffee can pop off to the kitchen and have a coffee, and those that want to ask questions can ask questions. Okay.
All right. I will just briefly touch on the strategy key points, and then just deal with my own questions at the end. But just to say that the city then developed this strategy, given the lessons learned through the drought, and it made these 5 commitments. And firstly, a commitment is a willingness to give our time and energy to something that we believe in, a promise, a firm decision to do something. And that was the sense of what we meant by a commitment. And these were, we will work hard to provide safe access to water and sanitation. We will promote wise use by all water users. We will ensure sufficient, reliable water from diverse sources, and we will work with our partners to guarantee increased and shared benefits from regional water resources. And then finally, we will actively facilitate the transition of Cape Town to a water-sensitive city. So I'd invite you to have a look at this link where the strategy is found, and if you don't go directly through this, go to the website Think Water, and I'll put that on my last slide, and you can get access to the current version of the strategy there. So the next few slides are more details on each of these. This is just a quick summary of the reliability of Cape Town's water. So we will continue to rely on rain-fed dams for most of its water. The city commits to building an additional 300 megs of capacity over the next 20 years. and the built environment will reduce the likelihood of the built program of severe water restriction in the future. And we obviously match increase in price of water with affordability, and the new infrastructure, know not to use it all the time, but the investment would not have been wasted. And desalination will become an important part of Cape Town's future, and proactively address regional water risks and then change relationship with our water. And I think there isn't a family in Cape Town that hasn't got a different view of water and water use coming out of the drought. Because during the drought, there wasn't a day where it wasn't a family discussion or dinner party discussion or whatever, when we still had dinner parties prior to COVID, of course. So now these are the five commitments, and I won't go into details because you will have access to a copy of this presentation, so you would be able to have a look at the details of it. But needless to say, there's a lot of thought that has gone into this strategy, and it has a very effective means of preparing us better for an extreme event of this nature in the future. And so I'd invite you to have a look at it if you get the opportunity and if you feel that you would like to learn from it. All right, so those are the last of which was, to work Cape Town towards becoming a water sensitive city, which I am very passionate about and believe is really very important. All right, so I wanted to just touch on the lessons that came out of this, and is prepare for droughts. Cape Town is vulnerable to climate change related risks, and realize that. So let's prepare for droughts. Let's not wait till they occur. And we've put action plans in place to be triggered at particular points as they occur, so that there is a set process to follow. Regional risks, resource risks need to be better managed. Agreed operating rules must be adhered to, and clearly they weren't during the drought. There were some transfers that should have taken place. There were a lot of problems on the national department side and on our side in some instances too. Necessary releases must be done timelessly, otherwise you waste the water and it runs away to the sea. Better catchment management, including seriously addressing the alien vegetation removal, and I'm pleased to say that has started moving very much in the right direction, and nurture better cooperation between the tiers of government. We need to build ahead of time on diversity resources, diversify resources. Risk can be further reduced through diversification, less dependent on rainfall. And that is the plan, is to move away from being 100% or virtually 100% dependent on rainfall. And over the next 20 years or so, we should achieve a reasonable level of diversity. Because as I'd mentioned before, you can't build your way out of the drought. National supply chain regulations. Now, during the drought, and when we were trying to put in place various initiatives, we were really hamstrung by huge constraints on the process of procurement. And then we were hit with audits afterwards. The Auditor General came down on us like a ton of bricks, obviously seeing a weakness and an opportunity there. And I think, some leeway must be given during these times of emergency, because clearly mistakes do get made. Responsive, effective, and consistent communication strategy, both on the internal side, which is very important, and obviously on the outside. Raising awareness, partnering, promoting citizenry. I mean, that is the key, getting everybody working together and aligned, and then dealing with fake news. We've heard a lot about fake news all over the world. Sustain water conservation and demand management practices in department, and support household resilience development. And that is very important too, where people are wanting to go as far as they can off the grid for, let's say, discretionary use of water. Let's support that. Let's give them the opportunity. So we looked at the bylaws. We looked at guidance documents for people using grey water, etc., etc., and that did help a lot. Then accurate metering. To measure is to know, the old adage, what gets measured gets managed, very important. So it's important that we have clear understanding and accounting within our water system to be able to manage effectively. And this leads to improvement in non-revenue water and results in better revenue management, ultimately revenue increases. Leak detection and repair program, we heard all about that yesterday. And my advice there is don't try to go too high-tech too fast. Simple is actually better and quicker. So that's something that we learned through that period as well. Pressure management, establishing zones of PRVs and controllers provides ability to limit usage in severe droughts without resorting to intermittent supply. I think I've said enough about that already. And then, of course, pricing water appropriate to affordability. And the concept of the water sensitive city, finally, I think is very important too. So that brings me to the end, and I'm certainly going to be open to questions, but I would just like to repeat this acknowledgement. My thanks to Dr. Kaiser. Gisela was my executive director at the time. And then, of course, to all my staff and management for their incredibly tireless efforts in responding successfully to one of the worst droughts that was experienced in the region. So, and then, of course, a lot of the material that I've used in this presentation also comes naturally from the city, and some of them, in fact, from Gisela Kaiser as well. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I think what we'll do now, we've actually run into the coffee time. So any of you that need a break, comfort break, or want to go and get a cup of coffee, now is a time to do it. What I'm going to do, though, in the meantime, is I'm going to I'll give a few questions to Peter. We've got a few questions there. If any of you do have other questions, if you can save them till the afternoon session, that would be good. I think Peter will come back for the panel discussion at the end. So if you have got other questions, we'll deal with them then, but I will deal with a few now. And a few people have mentioned that they found the slides a little bit hard to read because there was a lot of detail on them, and the resolution, they couldn't actually read the detail. So when Peter gives his presentation to SciC to upload, I will ask him to break his slides down into components so that we can get slightly larger versions of some of the diagrams, because there's a lot of valuable information on them that people were looking for, and Peter and I will sort that out. So before we go on to the next session at 11 o'clock, I'll go through a few questions. Okay, here's one from Johan Rudolph. Peter, and Peter, if you can try and answer the questions reasonably succinctly or briefly, that way I'll get through a few more, that'll sort it out. What was your experience with the secondary effects of imposing punitive tariffs? In other words, you've put these, by putting on these water tariffs of 1,000 rand a kiloliter, etc., what change did it do to the revenue from the water and the linked sewer tariffs? What did you go bankrupt, or did you manage to survive as a water company?
Okay. Being able to introduce adjusted tariff sets to the restricted level, in other words, aligning it with the sales levels for that level of restriction, did make a difference to the income stream. Obviously, it helped to balance that against our costs. The punitive level was never intended as a means of generating income. The punitive levels were there to drive people away from them. We didn't put them in place to make money. So largely people that did exceed those 35 kiloliter and find themselves in the, at the worst, 1,000 rand a kiloliter, many of them didn't pay, went into debt against those. But what we did was, when it was clear that it was an underground leak causing them to go into that, we had a relief system that we could, and there was a process to reduce that. In fact, the worst case was, I think, a 1.7 million monthly bill that was issued to somebody who had cleverly connected his, or not realizing it, but his plumber had connected his irrigation system to the potable supply system and was backfeeding down into a reuse that was feeding up into their estate. So they were losing a huge amount of water on a daily basis, and it was only realized after the second month. So from 1.7, we obviously reduced that down to just under 100,000 rand, which he had to pay, because I had no authority to excuse him, but we could find a way to actually limit it. But yes, to answer the question, I think it wasn't done as a means to generate income. Just the general tariff for the lower sets were where the income adjustment was made.
Okay, so you weren't dragging people off to prison for not paying a bill of 100,000.
No, it wasn't our intention to bankrupt people. It was a deterrent to try and drive people away from high usage.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Second question from Chibedi. How much budget was allocated to the actions for day zero during this period on your sort of water demand management? And how much money did you actually throw at this problem to get you through your day zero? It's a bit of a, it's quite vague. I realize that maybe it's a bit difficult to answer that one, but sort of ballpark, was it like 10 million, 100 million, 10 billion?
No, it was in the hundreds of millions. It's difficult for me to put a number on it now, because it was obviously spread across the whole budget profile. But it wasn't as though we were given a specific allocation. It was dealt with as emergency funding, and provision had to then be made in the next budget cycle. But it wasn't an insignificant number, if you put it that way. If he's meaning, if he's meaning specifically if we were going to get to day zero and what it would take to manage that, that's a different story. But in terms of just managing the drought, it was really built into the budget for water and sanitation.
Okay, this is one, someone wants their product named here maybe, or they just want to know who to contact. What type of flow limiting restrictors did you use in Cape Town? Was it a specific, did you have one specific brand there, or did you use a variation, or I think it looked like Aqualock to me, I'm not sure. I know there was another one from Durban, but maybe you can answer that question. That's a quick one. Yeah, there was more than one. Aqualock was one of them. Just the other one slips my mind now. Maybe you can remember the name. Yeah, suffice to say that the city is no longer installing those. They are still in the system, but they are being opened so that they no longer restrict, because there were problems with them where they would malfunction and then go into the fully closed or fully open position, and battery lives became a problem too. So the valve portion of that installation is no longer really being used in the city. Okay, so you had some teething problems with them, but they were used during the drought. But it was an effective means during that period and in the run up, and it was used as part of the city's debt management program as well, prior to and during the drought. Okay, thank you. I've got one from Nathaniel Padiachi. Thank you, Peter. With regards to going ahead with implementing water reuse, did the City of Cape Town consult the receiving public with regards to them accepting reuse water? I'm assuming we're talking about the reuse of effluent, turning it into drinking water here. He mentions that CISA, Sempcorp, which is obviously a PPP company somewhere, consulted the public on the north coast here in KwaZulu-Natal before constructing such a plant that treated final effluent and produced excellent water quality. The public response has been very positive, in excess of 95% acceptance, and is still a success. Is Cape Town using this consulting process, and have you had a similar response from the public?
Okay, during the drought, we obviously wouldn't have had time to go through a full consultative process, but in terms of the injection into the system, we were going to go for the indirect injection into the system if it became absolutely necessary. As I said, we'd built and operated a small pilot 10 megaliter a day plant, and the intention was if we weren't going to have to be forced to use it, we would use it, just run it and use the water ourselves as part of the sort of processed water, and use the plant to show and keep good records so the public could see the performance of that plant, to give confidence that going forward, once we ramped up to larger scale, the principle would be the same, and that the ability to maintain the right levels of water quality were there. As it happened, we didn't need to inject that water in. So it would have been a very much quicker process. Obviously, there would have been some form of consultation, but we haven't yet, or the city, I'm no longer there, so I shouldn't say we anymore, but the city hasn't embarked on that process yet. But certainly prior to going to that point in the years to come, when it will become part of the process, they will go down that consultative program.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Quick question here. What is the capacity of each desalination plant that you did? I think you mentioned you were going for 3 and 2 were eventually built. What was the capacity of each? What was the construction cost? And how quickly were they constructed?
All right, the capacities of them were the 2 on the False Bay coastline, one were BC and Strandfontein. They were 7 megaliter a day each, and the one in the waterfront was 2 megaliters a day. I don't have at my fingertips the actual cost. Now, bear in mind, the city put out a tender to pay per kiloliter of water supplied. So built into the cost that the contractor was tendering, he would have to cover all his own capital and operating costs for the 2-year period of providing that water supply. And as I mentioned, in the end, once those contracts closed down, the cost of the water supplied at 7 megaliters a day for 2 years, obviously not at full 100% every day, but came to very close to 50 Rand per kiloliter. So you can calculate back from that. I don't have the details of the contractors, capital costs and so on. But effectively what the city paid was what they had worked out they would need to recover their costs, plus presumably some profit.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. There's just a last follow-up question for now, and then we'll have a 5 or a 10-minute break for the next
sorry, one
session.
other thing is the waterfront one was at 38 Rand per kiloliter. The two bigger ones, the 7 megaliter ones, were 50 Rand a kiloliter. Okay,
oh,
sorry,
right.
Dan.
Okay. So we're 50 Rand a kiloliter for the 2 7 megaliter plants, and 38 Rand a kiloliter for the 2 megaliter plant at the waterfront. Is that that's what you said? Yeah. It's a follow-up question from the same person. What procurement challenges did you go through in obtaining the qualified service providers to construct the desalination plants? I suspect that might be a long answer, but maybe you can summarize it in a minute now, and if it's going to be a complicated answer, we can push it back to the session in the afternoon, because judging by what I read in the newspapers, this was quite a tricky one.
Yeah, look, we went out for a call for proposals and followed the sort of emergency procurement procedures that were available to us at the time, did a very rapid adjudication process, and then made the selection of the best, cheapest offers. And this was done across a broad spectrum of these projects that had gone to tender, but held off on final actual awards. And it was only these three that were the first that were already in the channel that got final award status. And by the time we were able to steer away from these temporary reuse and desal initiatives, we had already appointed three, and the rest we could then cancel. Obviously, under a lot of pressure from the contractors involved, because they had been notified that they were the preferred contractor, and some of them had already gone to the point of expending a fair amount of money at risk. So we took a lot of flack from them, and I sat in a room for a good couple of hours with Dr. Kaiser, getting fairly abused by these folks, but trying to explain to them that it was out of our hands and that we were not in a position to award these contracts because the city clearly didn't have the money to pay for it, and it didn't make sense to continue. So that's how it happened. But in terms of the process, it was the normal tendering process that we went out on a call for tender offers.
Okay, now thank you, Peter. I'm going to close the questions at this session now. We've pushed it in. Thank you for a very informative presentation. The one comment covers everything. Well done, Peter. You can certainly be commended for what you achieved. I think that is echoed by everyone that's listened to this. And if you are available this afternoon for a panel discussion, if you can sit in, there may be a few subsequent questions that pop up that we address to you then. So thank you, Peter. And people can take, we've got 10 minutes before Bambos is up for the intermittent water supply. So don't miss that. Please come back in 10 minutes time and we'll chat then. Thanks very much. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much.